This episode of Talent Development Leader Podcast is sponsored by Vim and Vibe. Modern learners are on the go, and they want short video chunks that are entertaining and have emotional hooks. Vim and Vibe Productions is a woman-owned video production and instructional design studio specializing in video microlearning that will not bust your budget. Learn more at vimandvibe.com. Welcome to ATD's Talent Development Leader Podcast, featuring monthly conversations with the greatest influencers in the talent development field. We cover the latest trends, hot topics, and future-focused ideas that current and aspiring TD leaders need to know. Learn more by visiting www.td.org and searching for Talent Development Leader Podcast. With over 25 years of experience in developing talent-rich organizations, Dr. Ludmila Praslova is a global inclusive talent strategy expert with deep knowledge of global diversity and neurodiversity. Her current consulting is focused on creating organizational systems for inclusion and well-being and providing neuroinclusion training and support to organizations such as Amazon, Bank of America, and MIT. Ludmila is the author of The Canary Code, a guide to neurodiversity, dignity, and intersectional belonging at work, published by Barrett Kohler in April 2024. And she's the member of the Thinkers 50 Radar 2024 cohort of global management thinkers most likely to impact workplaces. She is a professor of graduate industrial organizational psychology and accreditation liaison officer at Vanguard University of Southern California. Ludmila regularly writes for Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and Psychology Today, and is the first person to have published in Harvard Business Review from an autistic perspective. Hi, Ludmila. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
You've been working in diversity and inclusion since the 1990s, and you've witnessed both triumphs and opportunities for improvement when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which I'll call DEIB going forward. What are some of the biggest takeaways that you have gleaned from your decades of experience that you think are important for talent development leaders to understand?
Companies who are most successful is creating culture ad and even personality ad organizations. So sometimes we're talking about cultures and we have this very rigid idea that a person can only be one certain way, and it's good for organizations if everyone is kind of like a clone of another person. But it could, in a short term, feel like a good idea, but over time, in changing environments with all kinds of problems coming towards organizations, it makes more sense to hire for culture ad where people bring all kinds of different perspectives and even allow personality ad, because really, do you really want everyone in your organization to be extroverted? Research shows that we need a mix of different personality styles for successful teams, but sometimes organizations take culture fit to extreme and then they try, we'll brand our people so they're going to really project the same personality to the world. It is something that is also very taxing on individuals, because if someone constantly has to put in this extra emotional labor of projecting something that is not their personality and not something they are experiencing, it's extra labor that could have been put otherwise through their actual job tasks. And okay, so understand cast members at Disney World. Okay, that's a little bit different. But why do we want that from accountants and everyone in the organization who really could use their brain power to do something that is relevant to their immediate job responsibilities? And really, it taxes people without really bringing much benefit to organizations. So outside of things that are actually harmful and hurt people, we really want to think about culture add and human diversity, emotional and personal and cognitive styles add for organizations who really are the most resilient to meet a variety of challenges and have talent that can do different tasks, and they have different likes, different preferences that could all be matched to specific types of work, so we can maximize that human potential and let people work with their ability and to the maximum of their ability.
So I've had the pleasure of reading some of your recent articles, Ludmila, in which you address individual versus systemic level interventions within DEIB. In one called Today's Most Critical Workplace Challenges Are About Systems, published in HBR, you say systemic factors embedded in organizational cultures and processes are the primary cause of critical workplace issues. For example, leaders failing to execute strategy within organizations, threats to employee mental health and well-being, and a lack of belonging and inclusion. Often organizations attempt to address systemic causes with individual interventions. I see this, all the time, in training and development, obviously. And then when you think about DEIB and culture, what are some practical ways? And I don't know, there might not be practical ways. This might be a little more complex, but some tips you might have, some insights for how listeners might build systemic thinking and have that advantage at their disposal.
Sometimes it does require a little bit of an exercise and trying to look at an issue from multiple perspectives, but it helps if you're solving a particular problem. So just think about a particular problem. And let's say you want to improve your hiring, which is something that is a very real issue and it might come in. So you could say, okay, let's train managers to be more fair. And that would be the individual level solution. The problem is most biases operate way below our threshold of attention. And when we try to pay attention to those things, they can actually bias us more. So in experiments, when people were told, don't be biased, they put so much effort into not being biased in what they were saying that their body language actually became less inclusive, because humans only have so much mental capacity. And it is more helpful to just design a system within which there are checks and balances and scaffolding for people to be guided in ways that facilitate fairness. So instead of saying, okay, try not to be biased when you are interviewing people and do your best job. It's very hard for an individual to process all those multiple thoughts at the same time. But it's much easier to design a form that has very specific questions that are job relevant and job related, and only rating those items rather than irrelevant things that usually come in. Whether someone has a symmetrical face, you like their voice, and whether you want to drink beer with them, right? Those are typical things that come in the interviews. And I have a lot of other thoughts on interviews. I would actually rather eliminate them. But for people who are not ready to eliminate them, create a system with rubrics where you only look at categories that are objectively relevant to performance, and have at least a couple of raters using the same rubric and doing it independently. You probably are going to end up with better system, more fairness, and less bias without people having to monitor it. Or the famous example with an orchestra where for the longest part, white males were always hired to be the first violin.
Mm-hmm.
And when they just put a curtain there and even prevented people from hearing the sound, like if someone is wearing heels or not, where you can assume their gender, when all those cues were eliminated, it became statistically significantly more likely that women, for example, would be hired for those positions. So again, rather than telling people to control their bias, they created a system that by design facilitated bias. So by design is much more reliable and easier to use and produces more consistent results.
Wow. I would love to hear your thoughts on unconscious bias training. Some of the things that we tout in the industry for DEIB, and I'm sure there's lots of schools of thought around all of this, but and maybe another episode we can talk about, get on the interview path as well.
Unconscious bias exists, but 1 hour training could increase awareness about it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when people have a lot of time and they're not stressed out, they might be able to control some of it. But how many of us function in organization where we have plenty of time to relax and sit down and not make decisions on the run?
Right.
It just doesn't work in the regular work environment, because unless it becomes an automatic habit, something that we cannot acquire in a quick training, it has to go through our slow processing, our conscious slow processing. And there is only so much capacity. And when we're bombarded by sign this, answer that, and by the way, there's an emergency, our brains just literally can't process.
I mean, it sounds like for true change, right? True transformation in this space, you got to take it to the system level. I would love to get a little niche here. So certainly, we've been a little more macro so far, but neurodiversity is one of your specialties, your areas of expertise. In fact, you just published a book on the topic, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And you're writing an article for ATD's Talent Development Leader about neuroinclusion for leadership development.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about this. You've written that neurodiversity refers to the variation in the human nervous system development, which may influence cognitive styles, emotional and sensory processing, mind-body connection, learning, specific talents and abilities, and more. While originally discussed in the context of autism, the current understanding of neurodiversity refers to the full range of human neurological diversity. The broader understanding of neurodivergence refers to both developmental differences, such as ADHD and dyslexia, and acquired differences, such as PTSD, brain trauma, or long COVID. In your book, you share your experience as an autistic person in the workplace. Can you describe that experience for listeners today?
Sure. Well, the caveat that you met one autistic person, you met one autistic person. There are very different manifestations in each person, and they interact with our upbringing, with our specific abilities. So there are stories that resonate, and I have stories in my book, for example, that people say, oh my gosh, yes, me too. Mm-hmm. But then there are also very specific paths. So in my particular case, I figured out pretty early what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. So, I mean, having to work when you were 14 sounds like something that you don't actually want to do. But that really taught me that, for example, working at a factory is not something I'm ever going to be good at. And because moving machines are just not my thing. And I would be more open to like gardening and farm work. Mm-hmm. But I'm generally better with working with my head than with my hands, because I'm also dyspraxic, which often happens with autistic people. Mm-hmm. You're super uncoordinated. I have horrible handwriting. I can't catch a ball to save my life. So manual labor was just kind of not a good idea, even though that's where my family mostly came from. And I also figured out that working in an office where I'm constantly interrupted is not something I'm very good at. And I figured out I was probably 18 when I had, summer job. And I was like, yeah, I can do this job, but not in that environment. Mm-hmm. And I don't want people like interrupting me and telling me something different to do every 5 minutes, because that doesn't agree with my brain. And I also had a pretty good idea what I was good at. And I kind of self-directed my education to that. And I got a degree in kind of like mixed psychology, HR-ish, something. And then I just happened to fall into global diversity because there was a huge need, lots of expats. So 90s was the time when there was a lot of international exchange where people would not meet over Zoom, but physically go to another country and try to learn the language. And I just started doing it, and I discovered I was really good at it. And anything from translating, interpreting, helping people figure out what they were doing, trying to create organization that was merging various global cultures. So I tried that, and it was just so much fun. I loved it. And I've done that for several years. It aligned with my abilities in many ways. It was, always kind of an interesting challenge and interesting problem to solve. And I also started doing a little bit of teaching. It was kind of an organization that had various arms, from charity to teaching to a little bit of everything. And so it was all wonderful. But so here was an example where I always wanted to learn more. And professional development was always something I was just really, really, really interested in. And in my organization, we're promised professional development, kind of like pretty cool opportunities. And then someone else got it, and then someone else got it. And I'm like, I thought it was promised to the best performer, and I don't think those people are. And so I tried to politely inquire about that. And my boss looked at me like I was, something is seriously wrong with me. And it was like, we would never consider you, because that's just for men. So I was like, okay, well, that's not working. So basically I was like, okay, so I was 25 or 26 or something at that time. And I was like, okay, so I've reached my ceiling here. And again, I always wanted to learn. And at this point, I was also like, we are so inclusive on the global level, but we can't do gender right. So I decided that I needed to figure out how to do intersectionally inclusive organizations. And then I went to graduate school, and I had other jobs. I had academic jobs. Okay, but back to being autistic. I worked myself into occupations that were aligned with my abilities. And I was using job matching. So I kind of had a pretty good idea of where I fit. I study careers and work and jobs too. So I know where I fit and what I'm good at. And I also used a little bit of job crafting when I needed. But for the most part, I was able to get myself into positions where I did not have any issues with the core job responsibilities. I could do those jobs I had in my adult life, other than, my being working at the factory when I was 14. All of my adult jobs I could do in my sleep. The actual job tasks, exaggerating slightly, but I was a very good match. Where I was not a match is the extra things that jobs require. So sometimes you're thrown someone else's responsibilities, like to cover someone's leave, and then their job is completely different, but you're just somehow supposed to figure it out. And your office moves, and you're told to, pack in 2 days and go somewhere. And like the new office is super cold and your brain can't work there. So, or somebody decided to just change your job description, and from now on you're doing X, Y, Z, and you're like, that's not what I signed up for. And it requires, for example, attending really noisy events. And that's my thing. I cannot. Noise just kills my brain. My brain processes noise as pain. And any music that has a bass in it, it just completely kills me. Just a few minutes and I start crying and I can't control it.
Yeah.
So when things like that are thrown into my job description that had nothing to do with the job I signed up for, that's where I would encounter issues. And then just kind of the social things like, you know what, I just taught 3 classes and I was with students and that required a lot of social energy. Do I have to go and socialize with people at lunch? Like, why are they going to be mad at me if I just sit quietly in my office or take a walk and recharge? But people get mad at you and they feel like you're not social, and there's just only so much you can do because that requires energy. And some jobs are just not organized for people who recharge by themselves. Because if you are not seen or with someone else, somehow you are suspect, even though you're just trying to do your job and have the energy to do your job. So that is the kind of issues that I encountered rather than not being unable to do the job that I signed up for.
I'm sure many of our listeners this resonates with them. And it makes me think about, your comment about interviews and kind of throwing it out. And, what if conversations about jobs and employment and skills and the matching there were simply, what are you good at? What are you not? As you mentioned, right? What are your preferences? How does your brain work? How can we support you as an organization if you were to be employed by us? Just thinking out here on how that experience could be different for the interviewee and also the organization to tip this on its head. But yeah.
Could be so much better. Just test people on relevant mini tasks of the job. Little 30-minute snippets of the actual job will give you much better information and much better hiring than comparing someone who's really good at bragging versus someone who's actually really good at a job but not really good at bragging.
Mm-hmm. And you've touched on some of this in your story. I'd like to for listeners who are in talent development, who lead those functions in their organizations, who oversee diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, who are dealing with challenges around neuroinclusion. What are some of the common organizational barriers that you see when it comes to neuroinclusion?
Mm-hmm. And I divide them in my book into access barriers and success barriers. Mm-hmm. So access barriers start with job design. Sometimes you want someone who can do statistics while being constantly interrupted. That's the actual thing from the actual job description. It doesn't make any sense. Really, it doesn't make sense whether a person is neurodivergent or neurotypical. But sometimes people just ask for things that are really not compatible. And if you just hired someone who is really good at, guiding people and answering questions, and then you hired someone who's really good at doing analysis, you probably would get a much better outcome than trying to combine those things in one job description. And things like bustling office, it may not even be bustling. They just, cut and paste from somewhere, but someone may just not respond to that ad. Mm-hmm. And then we talked about hiring that relies on external cues such as eye contact and handshake and whether or not someone is fidgeting. And those things say absolutely zero about someone's character. It's all completely bogus, has absolutely nothing to do with their lying and pretending. Actually, a good liar is going to present as a very polished person and won't be doing all those things, but you will eliminate neurodivergent people thinking that, they're dishonest because they don't look you in the eye or because they're fidgeting. And so assumptions that have nothing to do and have no foundation in truth. Then just generally hiring that's not valid for the job. What we need to do is really tie each particular position to how the person is evaluated. But we have a very generic way of evaluating everyone. And so someone could be a customer service representative versus, AI AI accuracy monitoring expert. They need completely different personal styles and work styles, but we evaluate them in the same way, which doesn't make any sense. And if we develop more accuracy in matching particular hiring procedure to the actual job, we'll get much more hiring, a lot fewer bad hires where people just don't know like what to do with that person because you will be testing them on the actual job. And we will also have a lot more fairness because people who are good at the actual job will be hired.
Yeah.
So that's access. And then I could talk about it more also, providing different types of jobs, part-time jobs, flexible jobs, but let's talk about success. So let's say someone got into an organization and sometimes they just run into onboarding that requires them to, let's say, do the icebreaker that's really embarrassing. Or an icebreaking that requires a physical ability that someone doesn't have, that has nothing to do with their ability to perform the job. But you just kind of embarrass the person or other them at the very first experience. That's not helpful. And different learning styles, designing how we present, that we don't just have all videos for everybody or all reading for everybody. Let people learn in the way that works for them. Some people would much rather read. Some people would much rather watch videos. It's really not that hard right now to get transcripts of videos and proofread them so they actually make sense. And we are not really good at supporting different types of people. We just kind of create this one size fits all. And whenever someone doesn't fit, we kind of blame it on the person. So whether it's the lack of flexibility, why does it matter if the person has a different biological rhythm? And if your job requires writing, why do you care if they're writing at midnight or at 6 a.m.? It doesn't really matter. And it would help neurodivergent people. It would also help parents and all kinds of people with caregiving responsibilities or open offices. For some reason, the myth that they improve collaboration still persists there, despite studies that show open offices actually harm collaboration because people become stressed out and overstimulated and start emailing each other from the same room because it actually is stressful for most people. And let's say neurodivergent people, women will get stressed out first, and then neurotypical people and men. But in general, everyone over the long run is going to experience detrimental effects of an open office. So why do we still insist on sticking people into those? And if someone is trying to explain that they will be much more productive in a different environment, we just tell them, well, no special treatment. But don't you want productivity? It doesn't even make sense. It's we're trying to make stand on things that are self-defeating. We're shooting ourselves in the foot because we're not allowing people to work to the best of their ability. Why not give people performance enablement through the environment that allows them to be their best? I could talk a lot more about
I know.
that.
Oh man, you're just preaching to the choir here. I'm getting fired up. And it goes back to the system, right? So if the system dictates, these are in office versus out of office, right? Here's the policy, or these are your work hours, or here's the office structure, and you have to be in this open office space. Again, it's not taking into consideration individual preference, biodiversity, different ways people learn and work, and all of these things, the ways people want to socialize or not as part of their job. So yes, it makes total sense to me. I wonder if, from your experiences, are there any organizations that you've seen are really doing this right when it comes to kind of marrying the idea of neuroinclusion on a systemic level? Any examples from practice that you could share?
The most systemic neuroinclusion probably will be Alternauts. It's a tech company, a quality engineering company that's US based, and they've been around since 2013, so 11 years. They started remote from the start. Everyone has flexibility. People can work full time, 75%, whatever works for them. They're very transparent, so there's no secrets. All the management meeting minutes are posted. Promotions are completely transparent, and they all create what they call biodecks, basically data about this is me, this is my best work style, this is how I prefer my communication, this is what can trigger me. So there is the difference is normalized from the start, and that absolutely helps people to be very productive. It's been a very classic example of how so systemic changes work, and they've been tweaking as they went, because obviously you discover things as you go. But they tried to create a system for majority neurodivergent, for majority autistic workforce, and it worked. They've been around for a long time. Again, there are other companies. JP Morgan, out of the big companies, has a pretty good system where they do have people working in different positions. So not just, the standard autistic programmers. The problem with some of the other organizations that it's very specific. It's kind of pigeonholes people into this one type of job, and not all autistic people enjoy computers and love programming. Some are. But if we just focus on this one type of job, we're going to really pigeonhole people and prevent other people from working with their talents. So when companies allow not just we're hiring for this particular position and not any other position, but they just support people across all the different jobs, I consider that quite a bit more inclusive. Another very interesting company, not from the tech world, is Lemon Tree Hotels, which is a hotel chain in India. And they are very inclusive. They have inclusion for all the different types of people, victims, survivors of acid attacks. They started actually with hiring deaf people, but they also have a very interesting program for hiring people with Down syndrome. And they created positions that align with certain subset of human abilities. So, for example, their stewards or waiters are now kind of separated into two types of jobs. One is the highly social, chatting with customers, and another one is setting tables and bringing orders to the buffets. And the second part aligns very often with something that people with Down syndrome enjoy and are really good at. So they are aligning their abilities with that job. They train them in different ways. They have very specific training programs. Sometimes they use kind of pictorial, step-by-step manuals. And they don't actually pigeonhole them just to those jobs. They also have various coffee shop jobs, various room service and jobs. So whatever needs to be done in the hotel, they separate it into clusters of jobs that people with different sets of abilities and different sets of limitations can do. And they train them in ways that work for those specific people, and they further tweak even not just on the group level, but to specific individual, because obviously within the group, everyone is different. So they allow further flexibility. So that is another example where they look at people that other people don't hire or rarely hire, and they say, why not? Just challenging some of the common assumptions actually has led them to developing very robust workforce.
Before we close out today, I'd love to talk about your new book. I think just published last month, April 2024. Last week. That's awesome. Very exciting. It's called The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work. And I know you've been working in this field for years. What are you most excited about readers discovering from your newest research and writing that you debut in this book?
Well, thank you. I hope I provide enough of a framework that's easy to remember, plus human stories that people can identify with, and case studies that show people that, yes, this can be done. And again, lemon tree and ultra-nuts, there's a lot more in the book about those. But let me start with the framework. The title, The Canary Code, hopefully is something that people can also remember. So canaries in the coal mine. Sometimes we use this and we think it's expression. Maybe it's fiction. Maybe it's a folk tale. But it's not. There were actual canaries in coal mines, and in the UK, mines were required to employ 2 canaries up through the 1980s until they were replaced by electronic carbon monoxide detectors. But for many years, birds were taken down because they have more intense air metabolism, not because they're sick or weak, but because they're birds. And that's what they're designed to do, because to fly, they need more intense air metabolism. And so they're more sensitive to toxins. And when someone would see that the canary is not doing well, they would evacuate everybody. And they actually had canary resuscitator devices where they would give canaries oxygen. So sometimes people think this is so sad, canaries died. And it's not a job that I would want or anyone would want. But they actually did try to take as good a care of canaries as they could and treat them and give them oxygen when there was a toxic exposure in the mine. But so the parallel, neurodivergent people and multiply marginalized people are most sensitive to, let's say, the lack of flexibility, the lack of transparency in the organization. When it comes to neurodivergent people, and specifically autistic people, that's actually physiological. Our brains are more active. So our brains metabolize world and environment more intensely, like birds metabolize oxygen. So by design, we process more information. Autistic brain process about 40% more information at rest. For teenagers. So that's why we can get overwhelmed when there's too much going on in the environment, because we take in more information. That's why we also pick up on cues that long before other people do. And something that's, let's say, slightly annoying to other people is actually painful to us. And so if we create environments where neurodivergent canaries can thrive, that means that other people are highly likely to thrive in the same environments, because the air that's good for canaries is definitely good for the miner. And so that's an idea. If you create environments that work for people who are most sensitive, or for people who are dealing, let's say, with multiple issues in their lives and don't have extra resources to put into overcoming organizational dysfunction. And if we just support everyone with healthy and sensible systems, we are going to end up with workplaces that work for everyone and they're intersectionally inclusive. I have many stories that illustrate, issues that arise from the lack of inclusion or not understanding neurodivergent differences, and some sad stories. But I also have a lot of positive examples from companies that do it right, hopefully enough to illustrate that, yes, it can be done. And yes, it doesn't have to be prohibitively expensive, because sometimes it's just about listening to a human.
Thank you so much for your time with me today with the Talent Development Leader podcast. I would love for you to share how listeners might connect with you if they want to learn more, ask any of their own questions.
Absolutely. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. Sometimes unique names have drawbacks. Finding me on LinkedIn is a positive of having a unique name. So Ludmila Praslova it's going to come up. I do have a website, thecanarycode.com. just like my book title. There is also my university website if they wanted to look like some other aspects of what I do. But my LinkedIn actually has a lot of information. Many of my articles are linked there, and the same on the book website. A lot of my free access articles are also linked there, and it's a pretty easy way to find me.
Well, thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you, and thanks to all the listeners. Enjoy Ludmila's book, The Canary Code, A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope people will enjoy the book as well.
Thank you for listening to this podcast by the Association for Talent Development. If you found this show insightful or useful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.